As I comb through the internet, I am astonished to find different people writing about Philo of Alexandria. Some have written books, some are just teaching a class, some are just documenting what they found about Philo. But I am amazed that these people never came across the mystical experience that Philo had and the teaching on the God, Word, and Wisdom, or three equal powers. I am amazed that people never touched on this very thing. And I have contacted some of these, some are Jewish professors, some are just professors from universities, Christians, they say. And I've contacted them and asked them why they never wrote about these other things that Philo taught. But they don't have an answer for that. They just, one professor in particular told me that he didn't have time to look at everything. I didn't think that was a good answer. But the fact remains that if you study the works of Philo, you will find evidence that he was the originator of the Trinity doctrine. And that he even used scripture to try to prove his point. But he did it using the allegorical method. This is what he used. And he also says esoteric explanation. He also writes that down in his writings. So clearly, he was letting his readers know that he was doing it in a different way. So let's just take a moment and look at some of these things that he said. And you make your conclusion from there. Did Philo teach on a trinity of persons? On three gods or beings? On his book, Who is the Heir of Divine Things, he talks about the 3 days before the luminaries or before the sun. And you can find this also in the writings of Theophilus of Antioch, in the Ante-Nicene fathers, where he talks about the very same thing, the 3 days before the luminaries. And Philo says that it was God, his beneficent power, and his chastening power. And he talks about God, and then he says that the beneficent power was also God, and that the chastening power was the Lord. So here you have a clear teaching that it was God, and his two ancient powers was God, God, and Lord. This is Philo of Alexandria. He says God, the one in the middle, is standing above both of the other powers on top, and a type of this was the mercy seat, and that where God stood between the two cherubim. That was his example of the Trinity he was trying to convey. And of course, they even used a triangle after this explanation. And he also said that those ancient powers of the living God were equal. Does not the Trinity teach that all three members of the Trinity are equal? On his book on Abraham, he speaks about the time when God appeared unto Abraham, and it was God and his two angels in Genesis 18. But right away, Philo, with his esoteric explanation, says that he speaks to them not as three persons, but as one. In other words, even though there were three, it was really one. This is clearly a teaching on the Trinity. And it said that the three beings appeared in the guise of men. In other words, they were three persons. And he clearly says that it's an esoteric explanation. He doesn't call it biblical knowledge. He doesn't call it sound biblical teaching. No, esoteric, allegorical. On his books on rewards and punishment, he actually coins a phrase that is used in the Nicene Creed. He said, "But these men have arrived at the real truth, who form their ideas of God from God, of light from light." And of course, this is not real truth. This is philosophy, and it is a lie. Because Greek philosophy is polytheistic, and it is always taught that there's many gods and goddesses. On his book on providence, we can see where he developed further his idea of God, Word, and wisdom. Throughout the writings of Philo of Alexandria, you will find where he talks about God, and he talks about his Word, which he considers to be the second God. And then he talks about wisdom, which he considers to be the third. Here on providence, he says that the Word was the likeness of the second God, who is the Word of the other. Clearly, you can see how Philo was teaching a plurality of gods, but he made it seem like it was one God that appeared as three, and three that were one. On his book, A Treatise Concerning the World, he continues saying the one in the middle is the Father of the universe, or the I Am. And then he says, he calls the powers, changes it up a little bit. The Word he calls the creative power, and the wisdom he calls the royal power. And again he says that the creative power is God, and that the royal power is the Lord. And then he says it clearly. This is a vision at one time of one being, and at another time of three. Clearly, Philo of Alexandria is teaching a Trinity. And of course, through my research, I found out that the Ante-Nicene Fathers took up his writings because they were all philosophers, had a background in philosophy. They saw nothing wrong with Greek philosophy, mixing it up with the gospel. And so they took up Philo's teachings and they put him into the doctrine of the Catholic Church, really. And they came up with this Trinity. They developed it, they formed it, and it went all the way up to the Nicene Council. And Eusebius presented his idea already written out, and they took his document and then revised it. And this is what became the Nicene Creed. I mean, history points clearly to all of this. And the fact that others have ignored it or denied it or omitted it does not change the truth that the Trinity is a false teaching. It's a pagan doctrine formulated from Greek philosophy and the ideas of a first century Jewish Greek philosopher who was meditating when he got this idea.